everyone. My name is Ronan Lavelle from Validato. I'm joined today by my very good friend, Justin Craigon from BT. And we're going to talk today about using MITRE ATT&CK to drive threat-informed defense strategy reviews. This is actually, we're not going to tell you too much about what it is because Justin's going to present exactly what it is. But essentially, we are going to be talking about doing some threat profiling in different industries, understanding what threats and threat actor behaviors are most prevalent, and what you as cyber defenders can do to best prepare your defenses for the best return on your buck, essentially. So Justin, maybe if you just go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, I'm Ronan Lavelle. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Validato. We are a security controls validation platform. So we simulate cyber threat behaviors using MITRE ATT&CK techniques. And we show companies where they're exposed to threats. And I'll let Justin, you can introduce yourself.
Yep. Thank you, Ronan. Hi, morning, everybody. So I work in BT. BT, obviously, you'll know us for things like broadband and mobile phones and things like that. But we also actually have more than 3,500 security people. And we kind of divide ourselves into three groups. We have people who protect BT's own networks, people who protect customers' networks, and then I'm part of a smaller group which is externally facing. I go out, work with customers in the market, and offer them sort of guidance on security and help solve the security problems for them.
Wonderful. So just before we go into the content of the webinar, maybe just go to the next slide, Justin, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, actually, we've just been to the next one as well, if you don't mind. So a little bit of housekeeping. As you may have seen at the top of the webinar, we are recording today's session, and our aim is to send you a copy of the slides and the recording after the session. And we want to make this as interactive as possible. So we're going to have a Q&A session just towards the end of the presentation. And at the bottom of your Zoom console, so the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. So please feel free to type any questions you have in that Q&A button. If you do, by the way, see a chat function, which I think they may have removed now in Zoom webinar, do not use the chat because the chats are recorded in the recording, whereas the Q&A are not recorded. They are anonymous. So Justin and I will see the questions. Please do feel free to ask as many questions you like, and enjoy the content. Justin, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ronan. So okay, so like Ronan says, we're talking about MITRE ATT&CK and how we can use it perhaps less in a defensive way, perhaps in a more proactive way to inform strategy reviews. Quick kind of intro. If you think normally like strategies and roadmaps, they're typically high level, they're strategic documents. They cover a number of years, they have lots of different projects in them, and they're usually driven by a top-down approach. So, macroeconomics or legislation or budget constraints, that sort of thing. So what I'm going to show you today is a way of using MITRE ATT&CK to give a bottom-up data-driven approach, which will complement that top-down view. I'm going to show you how there is a relationship between TTPs and mitigations and CIS controls, and I'll go through the language in a moment. And I'm going to show how the industry affects the recommendations that you should be doing, and how you can review that roadmap in different ways. So if we start with the kind of language, just so we're all on the same page. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but these are some of the things we will be talking about. Perhaps you'll be aware, hopefully you're all aware of the MITRE ATT&CK Framework and the idea of the tactics, techniques and procedures, the TTPs. People are less familiar with the mitigations. So I'm going to be spending a lot of time on that. And essentially a mitigation is a way of blocking, preventing, restricting, mitigating adversarial behaviors. Okay. So if we have a look at the relationship between a TTP, so the technique and procedure, and mitigations. One of the things I've done a bit of analysis, and I've come up with a list here of top 10 attacks that I'm seeing at the moment. Now, these are industry agnostic. It's no geography, so there's no filtering. This is across networks. What are we seeing? So the left-hand side is those top 10 TTBs, and the top one there, escape to host. Essentially, that is attackers trying to get out of a cloud environment into the kind of hypervisor. So, and you imagine if they do that as a huge prize. So on the right-hand side of the screen there, I've got T1611 escape to host. The items in green below are various mitigations, which can all be used to help stop that happening. If we look at the first one, I'll use, hopefully you see my mouse here. So first one here, 1048, application isolation and sandboxing. Yep, it includes 1611, so that gets a point. That's great. But if we look over here, privileged account management, that includes 1611 escape to host, but it also includes T1098 account manipulation. And if you look over here on the left-hand side, account manipulation is the second most prevalent attack we're seeing. So mitigation 1026, privileged account management, in fact, in a way, is a bit of a better bang for your buck because you're addressing the number one concern and the number two concern potentially with one project. And that's the idea of what I've sort of coming up with in terms of using mitigations and weighting them and trying to work out which one will be the most effective for you. We'll come back to this slide, I think, because this list here on the left of the most important TTPs is something we're often asked. So if we dive a bit deeper into what a mitigation is, I've taken this from the MITRE ATT&CK website as an example. So I mentioned 1026, privileged account management. So here's what it is on the MITRE ATT&CK website. You see it talks about policies, controls, and tools. So we're not just talking about a technical solution, okay? We're talking about policies, we're talking about procedures, we're talking about tooling, but it's all three of those. And MITRE will suggest various measures. So they've mentioned RBAC in there, they've mentioned Active Directory group policies. They've mentioned tooling like CyberArk. They've mentioned MFA, multi-factor authentication. All of those can contribute towards privileged account management. Okay, so it could well be you're doing some of that already, but if not, you can go and look at that MITRE website. You can look at privileged account management as a mitigation, and you get some more ideas what you could do. So if we take it on a bit further. So I started with the list of the most popular TTPs for that 90-day period. So what I've come up with here is actually a prioritized list of the most effective mitigations based on that TTP list. So if your industry looked very similar to the list I had, these would be the things you should go for. So these are the top 10 things I'd advise people to look at. And if you look at it, there's nothing particularly unusual there. Privileged account management, that's a standard thing. You've got lots of other familiar advice in there. You've got multi-factor authentication in there, number 7. You've got hardening there, disable or removing features of programs. That's about device hardening. Operating system configuration there, number 4. Fundamental. If you don't configure things right, you can always find a way through it. So there's nothing in there which is unusual or surprising. So that's how it should be, because there's lots of standard good advice. Okay. So remember at the start I said I did the list based on a generic, no industry particular. So what you can then start doing is saying, okay, how does it work if I look at some different industries? So Ronan, what I've got here on the left-hand side, these are the top 10 mitigations for generic mitigations. On the right-hand side, I've said, well, okay, if I worked in the government space, how would that look? And you can see that halfway down the list there on the right-hand side, execution prevention has jumped up to number 4. So it's gone from number 8 to number 4. Same project, same mitigation, but in terms of a priority, if you worked in that government space, that mitigation would be more relevant. You would see more attacks which would be mitigated with that approach. And
Yeah,
also,
I think it's super interesting, Justin. I think
yeah.
we from the Validato side, we look at threats a lot and threat behaviors.
Mm,
And when you're looking at things like execution of malware, for instance, there are many what would seem to be living off the land or benign functions of Windows that
Yeah.
attackers use to manipulate that function.
Yep.
And this is a really interesting other way to look at it. It's almost like looking into the future because I, the way I see
Mm.
the MITRE ATT&CK community working today is it's very heavily focused on detections.
Yes.
Everyone admits that mitigation is the next frontier, and this is a super interesting way to join, technical threat, cyber threat,
Yep.
with business case justification. Because I think
Absolutely.
we hear, even yesterday I heard from somebody where a project was not approved by the finance team of their employer
Okay.
because they couldn't make a big enough case. And I think what you're trying to
Right.
say here is, in the context of threats, there are things that you can do um, that would have a much bigger impact on your business case potentially.
Absolutely. So there is a direct link between um, attackers and industries. We know certain attackers go after certain industries, right? Each of those attackers will then have a set of TTPs, techniques and procedures they use. So you can say, if I'm in this industry, these are the attackers most likely to hit me. These are the attacks they're most likely to use. It's not a given because it could be a new entrant. I might do something different. But in terms of risk management and profiling, that's a standard approach, kind of threat led. What this is doing is then saying, okay, so knowing those threats, what defenses should I put in place, and how do I order and prioritize those? So I'll do a bit more. I'll show you another couple of examples, Ronan, and then we can dive a bit more into how we do that. So again, left-hand side, top 10 list, right-hand side, manufacturing. And actually, you can see here very little difference. The only difference is number 10 switched. They're saying do a bit more time on password policies. That could be, maybe it's related to OT. In terms of they will often have default passwords installed on bits of OT kit because it's just so hard to change them. It could be something like that. If we look in the finance industry, this is the last one. I've only got 3 examples today, but we can see that halfway down, a couple of things just flip. Like I said, this isn't unexpected, right? You shouldn't be seeing massive differences between industries in the top 10 because it's generic standard advice. But if you start moving down the list, so I've showed you the top 10 mitigations. Here's numbers 11 to 20 on the left-hand side, generic. And then on the right-hand side, there's the industries. And you can see now that they diverge a lot more. They're starting to vary. And that's kind of to be expected because if you imagine if you had a big rollout plan, you're starting a completely greenfield site, you're going to say, right, what are my assets? Where's my inventory? Have I got MFA turned on? Have I got a complex password policy? You're going to do all that good stuff first. Yeah. And then once you've done all that good stuff, you get past your top 10, then you're into what should I do next? Yeah. And
So
that's perhaps,
Justin, how if you were to address, say, the top 10
yep.
mitigations for your industry or generically,
Mm.
what sort of defensive impact do you reckon that would have
You, you,
generally on an organization's
uh,
defensive posture?
you'll see different stats depending on who you ask, but it's going to be in the 90%, right? Because
Mm.
if you, most attacks still come from phishing. So hence the reason for having MFA. If they get a username and password, they still need a second way of getting in, right? So all of these things are about risk reduction. If you do the top 10 type stuff, it's why if you look at something like Cyber Essentials, um, the information in there is, get MFA, do backups. It's standard stuff because it works. It's only when you people tend to get attacked, not because they haven't got necessarily good defenses, but because something's gone wrong in that defense. They might have installed MFA as an example, right? But they might not have configured it properly. So then, they get hacked and they say, "Oh, I don't know why I got hacked. I had MFA." Well, yeah, but you didn't set it up right, or actually, you were getting bombarded with SMS text messages telling you to send the code somewhere else, and you did it because that was obviously someone trying to brute force it, that sort of thing. So the once you've got past the top 10, the 11 to 20, that's where you start seeing divergence more on the industry. So each industry would have the kind of ideal rollout plan in effect. Yeah. And what you can then do, Ronan, is if you've got those mitigations, you can start grouping them together into similar areas. And this is where you start getting more into the strategy side of things. So I took that initial top 10 TTPs, map them to mitigations, now map them to CIS controls. Okay, and there are mappings which exist for that from MITRE. And if you look at this list of CIS controls here, the ones in red I've kind of grouped together and they're similar. So number one, remediate penetration test findings. In other words, do a pen test, find a problem, fix it. Okay. Number three, actually perform the test in the first place. Okay. Number 10, automated vulnerability scans on externally exposed enterprise assets. Again, similar stuff. So those three kind of go together. So you might do a project around pen testing and vulnerability management. Okay. So you would group those controls together. Okay. You may, if you look at the Amber stuff, the Amber is around kind of configuration and account management, and the green is access control. But what's interesting, Ronan, again, if we go back to the greenfield example, if you were using something like the CIS controls to decide which controls to deploy, you'd start at the top of the list. Number one, I think, is asset. Have a hardware asset inventory, right? Then number two, software. And you go down that list of the 18 controls, bump, 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 bump. CIS then categorize them into three different implementation groups, 1, 2, and 3, which are basically increasing maturity, right? But unless you're told otherwise, you're going to start with all the IG1 stuff because it's the simplest, it's the most basic, and that's still solid advice. But interestingly, there's some of the stuff in IG2 and IG3, which this method is suggesting actually should be higher priority. So CIS will say do IG1 first, bang. I'm saying actually maybe you should be looking at IG2 and IG3 because if you're going to group those things into a project anyway, you can get possibly more bang for your buck. And deploying projects at the same time saves money rather than repeated startups and close down, startup and close down, right? So
I'd love to know what some of the people on the call, by the way, think about this. So remember, there's a Q&A button. So ask any questions and we will answer them in a few minutes' time.
Yeah, thank you. So I've done a mapping there to CIS controls. I also did a mapping to NIST scoring. Not a very particularly pretty slide, this, Ronan, but on the left-hand side, there are various capability groups that NIST calls them. Access control come out number one. And another one, system and information integrity. So that's basically system monitoring, configuration settings. So again, standard stuff. Okay. But this is perhaps the bit that people won't have seen or thought about before. Hopefully this is a bit that's completely new for people. So earlier on, I grouped things into CIS controls. Okay. And I sort of color coded them. So trying to sort of replay a bit of that. One of the things we spoke about was pen testing with a group of projects. Okay, so those I've got up here in red. At the bottom of the screen, I've got an imaginary roadmap. We're going to do some in this imaginary roadmap. We're going to do some segmentation work. We're going to do some data flow mapping, firewall rule rationalization. Okay, we're then going to look at a CASB deployment. We're then going to do some attack surface management work. And we're then going to do some privileged access management. That's our order of projects, probably driven by lots of good ideas, good things, right? But if you look to the mitigations I'm suggesting, actually, things like the PAM, which I've got fourth in this roadmap, should actually probably be number one. So we may be deploying it in this reason for very good reasons, like resource availability or cost or whatever it is. But if you're going purely on a data-driven approach, that the research I've done suggests that actually that PAM project should be jumping forward into your roadmap. You should be bringing it forward and doing it earlier because you'd get more benefit from that than some of the other projects. Network segmentation, filter network traffic was in there. It was towards the bottom of the list of mitigations, but it was in the top 10. We've got that at the start, so great. Let's carry on. Let's do it. But why are we doing it before PAM? Okay, so I think you can, if you do this exercise, you can do this kind of ready reckoner very simply to say, okay, here's the order of projects we've got. Does that match up to what the mitigations are saying we should be doing? So you can swap those around like old school, like you would do with post-it notes, like people used to in terms of project management. Okay, and you can also look at the MITRE descriptions for what mitigations are. and then look at your projects and say, have we got any gaps? We're deploying segmentation, and here's what we've got in our project plan. What does MITRE say we should be doing about segmentation? Are we missing a trick? So it's another way of just checking what you've done. Okay, you can take it a level further, because let's say that you've got two projects which are very similar in terms of bang for your buck. I've got methods of doing this where I can actually quantify projects and work out the value of that project in terms of defense. So you can basically take, I could take a roadmap item from someone and then work out the mitigations that we're going to implement from that, and then reverse engineer it. So we have roadmap, mitigation, TTPs. You can then start saying, well, actually, how much of that TTP does it address? You can apply weightings. So you can do all that lovely scientific stuff, and then you can have heat maps and and effectiveness ratios and all that sort of good stuff. But that's taken it a level beyond. And for the vast majority of people, as an exercise, this is really quick, and you can come up with a different order to your roadmap. And when we speak about roadmaps and strategies, these are kind of 5 typical inputs into it. They're all top-down driven stuff. We might spend quite a bit of time, though, in that risk assessment stage, working out where our threats are and working out what we're going to do about it, and then put it in place and then forget about it. This method I've developed, you can do this in a day, and you could have a kind of ready reckoner to actually just sanity check the roadmap ordering. And what you're then doing is, rather than everything being top down, you've got some bottom up stuff from the CIS controls or the NIST scoring, that sort of thing, going into your risk assessment, going into that overall mix. So it's never, no one of those 5 things on the screen should ever be the sole reason for doing a project. It's always going to be a balance, but this is just another input into that, perhaps using MITRE ATT&CK in a way that people don't use normally. So I'm going to wrap up soon, Ronan, but I'm going to just got a final couple of slides on things that people should think about if they're going to follow this approach. So I mapped things on an industry level. Okay. Your company may not exactly match a customer environment or an industry exactly, but it's a good guide. If you work in retail and you see that Marks and Spencers and the Cops just got hacked, alarm, like they did, so alarm bells should be ringing. You should be looking at how that has happened. Put your defenses in place to prevent the same sort of thing. But this isn't an exact science. This is about a mapping, and it's about perceptions and making sure that your company is aligned to what the data is saying. I talked about the 5 things in a strategy. The roadmap alignment is only kind of one input into that. And when you deploy a control, you may have budgetary constraints or resource constraints, or it could be like you said, your CFO doesn't sign something off because of a budget, and so you've got to haggle a bit. And this is a way to help you haggle. How effective the control is deployed is key. I mentioned before about MFA. If I've seen lots of research where it will say, like, MFA is the first thing you do, and that's great. But if you look at insurance claims in the cyber insurance industry, actually it's not even in the top 10, I don't think. But when it does go wrong, it's usually because something's been deployed incorrectly. When I do this analysis across a really wide scope, the thing that tends to come up more than anything else is misconfiguration. So, all the tools in the world don't solve anything if you don't deploy them properly, you don't have processes in place, and you don't have the people trained to operate them. Okay. The other thing, bear in mind, is this is essentially a snapshot. You're looking back at, let's say, the last 90 days or whatever it is, and threats change. So this is an exercise you should do regularly. I'd recommend doing it quarterly. You can get a good view. You're not going to sit in front of the business side of things and go to a budget meeting and ask for more money more often than that. So it's a good way of linking it into that budget cycle. If you don't do that and you take a one size, a snapshot at one point in time, you're going to be focusing on old TTPs, and your roadmap is then effectively based on a point in time, and never, and if you're not updating, it's not going to be relevant. So you do need to do it. The other thing, bear in mind, what I've said on the screen here, attack is adversary centric. Okay, it doesn't cover all the different threats. It doesn't cover misconfigurations, like I said, for example, right? So use things like the CIS controls and mitigations together to give you a broader set of defenses. Beware of false confidence. If you focus on just getting doing all the top 10 mitigations and go, great, I'm covered. Nah, doesn't work unless you've got to focus on the effective controls for your industry and for your environment. And again, just reiterate, one size doesn't fit all. You may not align to an industry average. But if you do all this, Ronan, it does bring some really nice benefits. You can rank your roadmap against actual industry threats rather than checklists. Once you've ranked them and you've got new ideas for new projects, you can look to see how those projects would move you up against that ranking. So you can start seeing your own maturity rise against a kind of dynamic framework rather than a static one like CIS or NIST. You can also, we spoke briefly about going to the board, right? People will often say, "Oh, I'm going to go and do this because I'm going to deploy EDR with my behavior telemetry." That doesn't mean anything to a board, but you can combine it with and hunt capability for T1566. Great. Now I can talk to the SOC. I can talk to them at 156. You can use those mitigations and take them up a level. Okay. By doing the mitigations bit and the CIS controls, especially, it starts raising the language from technical towards the business world. And there's other things we can chat to about ways of doing that. And ultimately, to end on, for me, it creates a more threat-informed, industry-aligned security strategy. So it gives you defenses which are data-driven, proven out in the industry, and should benefit you. And you've got a good reason for doing projects in the first place.
Justin, that's really awesome. We actually have a few questions actually coming through, but I would very much welcome any more questions you have. I think you answered the first one, by the way, which was realistically, how often should you perform these strategy reviews? I think you were mentioning a sort of quarterly cadence.
I'd say quarterly, just because I think it aligns with, tends to align with people's budget cycles, right? If you do it's quite a quick process. You can do it in a day without any bother at all, okay? So you could do it monthly, but things probably wouldn't change enough for you to make it worthwhile doing that. So I'd suggest quarterly as a starting point.
Okay. Next question is, why do anything if you still have passwords? MFA helps, but with passwordless and passkeys, should that not be the priority? Even if you can't implement it today, you should at least have a plan to get there.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, in BT, we use passwordless logins to our laptops. We have tokens to log into mobile phones if we need to, for example. So passwordless, great. This is data from MITRE, how they're mapping their TTPs to mitigations. So I should maybe go and check about where passwordless comes into that. Actually, it'd be an interesting thing to see if it's mentioned as one of the mitigations or not. And if not, that's might be something we should refer back to the special interest group, Ronan, as a suggest.
It's a very good point. And actually, just as Justin just mentioned that. It's an open secret that Validato and MITRE and Lloyd's Banking Group and a couple of other organizations are coming together in Q1 next year to create essentially the user group for MITRE ATT&CK in Europe. So for people who have a professional interest in looking at MITRE ATT&CK for use in cyber defense, it's kind of like a birds of a feather, non-commercial community. But if anyone is interested in joining that, it's obviously free to attend. There's no sales policy, so no vendors, all that kind of stuff. It's a knowledge sharing environment, but we will send you more information about that in due course. The next question is, how do we prioritize which techniques to focus on first so that we don't get overwhelmed? Trying to cover everything. I think I might
Yeah,
try and have a first stab at that, if that's okay,
yeah, go, yeah.
because it's kind of like central to what Validato is trying to achieve. So you could look at MITRE ATT&CK and the 365 odd techniques and then
Mm,
sub techniques out there. And some organizations think that they need to be green or be covered in every single technique. And
yeah,
it's not a productive way to look at cyber defense, in my opinion,
agreed.
because as we've already seen today, there are very specific, commonly used. There's a an organization in the US that calls these forever techniques,
Mm,
the MITRE ATT&CK behaviors and techniques that adversaries are going after over and over again. So it's almost like there's an 80-20. It's
yeah,
not quite that, but there's a
agreed.
certain,
Yeah,
yeah, subset of techniques that are exploited over and over again. The techniques, for the most part, tend to be features or functions of Windows or Linux, and therefore you can identify which techniques
uh,
are
yeah.
exploited by industry or even by threat actor. Validator kind of shows you that mapping, if you like, because we
Mm.
simulate that behavior and activity. But I think, Justin, maybe you can add your
Yeah,
2 cents there.
I totally agree. Right, trying to fill up the MITRE ATT&CK framework and put a tick in every box is a waste of time because half the controls you'll never need or use are not in your environment. For example, um, things like phishing is still the most prevalent attack. And the reason is because it works, especially now with AI making crafting phishing emails so much easier. Back in the old days, when the emails about Nigerian princes, one has given you $1 million, those emails read awfully. Anyone of basic English comprehension could read those and say this is really badly written, right? That was the reaction. It wasn't worth the attackers spending the time making that email read nicely because they were getting enough hits anyway. That's the thing. So, and it's still the case. It's still something like 95% of ransomware attacks start with a phishing email. Um, they then, they'll ask you to then go on the website and type in your credentials. That gets, that then gets in attack world. That's T1078 valid accounts. That's one of the most popular attacks. And it's then very hard to stop that because if I'm logging in and if an attacker's got my login and they log in, it's got the right username, the right password. That's where then something like MFA comes in because it's that second factor to say, well, have they got that second factor token code or whatever it is? Are they logging in from, I'm in cloudy Ipswich today? Are they logging in from cloudy Ipswich or are they logging in from Guatemala? So you start getting into things like geofencing and that sort of stuff.
I
Zero
think it's
trust
also
world.
important, Justin, to note that while an adversary might manipulate a particular technique or
Mm,
behavior, the mitigation doesn't always equate to having to spend money, right? So
absolutely. Yeah. So let me
there's a
just
lot of
jump
stuff
back
that you
a
can
slide.
do for no
Yeah,
or low cost.
absolutely. So let me jump back to an earlier slide. So if you go on the MITRE website, look at mitigations, I highlighted the bit on the screen, policies, controls, and tools. I tend to say, policies, processes, and tools. The language doesn't really matter, but if you deploy a tool and deploy it wrong, it's useless. If you deploy a tool and you don't have the people to operate it, it's useless. All right. So you need the policies and you need the processes in place before the tooling. Okay. Um, Spending money on tools without decent governance in place, decent training, decent awareness, decent processes, you're not going to maximize that investment. Um, there's a history, Ronan, of people spending a lot of money on various point solutions. You know, they overlap, they leave gaps, and attackers find a way through, or that they found out actually, they're using that application and they've not put the latest patch on it, or they're not configured it right, and that's how they get in. back to what I said earlier about misconfiguration being one of the top attack vectors. That's how it happens. One of the reasons that as a result of that, one of the things we're seeing in the market now is a drive towards reduced number of tools and more of a platform type approach. Going to a single vendor and buying a suite from them. It's just, it's like a cycle. People who have got one suite of products then say, actually, I'd like to get this now because it's best of breed, and I'll buy that one, and then they add to it, and then they get a load of tools, and then it contracts down again. So at the minute, I think we're heading towards people getting rid of the tools and rationalizing the estate back down to a single, one or two type vendors. So that's what we're seeing in the market.
Indeed. There's one last question before
Mm.
we let you all go, but I hope today's been insightful and interesting for you. What is the biggest challenge in showing the business value from this approach?
That's a great question. So business biggest. I think what you have, what one, okay, I can maybe answer it with what I would do. Okay, is always the way I'll answer it. It's a great question. When you're deploying a tool, right? That's what most of these things are about. People want to deploy a tool and they want to stick CyberArk in or whatever it's going to be, or Lumio or Validato, whatever it is they're going to buy, and they're going to deploy it. They want to do that and they want to get a return on their investment. Okay. So one of the easiest ways to kind of calculate that and bring it up to a business level is to look at your company revenue. Okay. And get your annual revenue figure and get that annual revenue figure and divide it by 8,760. And why 8,760? Because there's 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. If you do the sums, it comes to 8,760. So if you take your company revenue divided by 8,760, that's how much money your company makes an hour. Now, it's a very rough and ready figure. You can argue about seasonality. You can argue about, our company only works 9 to 5, but it's a way of quantifying what your company makes an hour. If you then look at that tooling and you can say, actually, if we deploy this tooling and we were hacked, actually, it's going to reduce our downtime from 10 hours down to 5, right? Straight away, those 5 hours you've saved, you can look at your revenue and you can go to the board and say, based on this analysis, I'm going to say by deploying this tool, I'm going to save you this much money. You take the tool, you take the impact of deploying that tool, and you turn it into a financial figure. And that financial figure is what someone on the board wants to see. And if you can't turn it into a financial figure, you're asking the wrong question. You need to do things like the 5 whys technique about why it's important to do this. Eventually, when you get to number 4 or 5, it will start coming down to money. It'll be like, we're losing customers, we're getting downtime, we can't make sales, things like that. So top tip, 8,760 and 5 whys technique will get you from tool deployment up to board ready presentation.
I love that. There are some people on today's call from very illustrious consulting companies as well. I wonder what they think about that, but that's really
just
a great
giving them
little
their
tip.
secret sauce. Yeah.
I might use that myself.
Well, I got it from someone else, right? Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun.
So I want to thank you very much, Justin. It's been really insightful because there are other questions. I think we'll probably park them for today, but a lot of our observations about the use of MITRE ATT&CK in cyber defense up until this point has been very heavily focused on detections, quite rightly. I think what you covered today around protection and mitigations and mitigating strategies is the future. And actually to be able to provide those insights to understand what should we mitigate first that will have the biggest defensive impact and business case impact. It's really, really interesting.
Don't stop. I'm not saying don't ever stop looking for those IOCs. That's not it. But in parallel, look for your IOCs and then think, okay, what should I be doing next? Because it'll make next week, next month, next year a lot easier on you.
Indeed. I want to thank you, Justin, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. Hopefully it was useful and interesting for you. And would love to continue the debate either in private or on LinkedIn, absolutely, wherever. But also would love to see you at the ATT&CK user group when we launch that. It'll be around the March timeframe, by the way. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye.